I'd like to talk to you for this first half of the session about Ovid Ars Amatoria 3, which is one of your set texts, right? And specifically, I want to focus on humour and on the passage at the centre of the text, which ostensibly is about instructing women on how to laugh. I want to start by outlining what I see as the particular challenges of putting this text on your curriculum. Challenge number one, I think, is that this is late Ovid, right? So you already have a job getting students to read the whole of Ars 3 without reminding them that in order to understand Ars 3, you've really got to read the first two books of the Ars. So it's late in Ovid's erotodidactic project, let's say, but it's also late in his whole elegiac project, which is unprecedented in its ambition and in its scope. So this is a text which is first and foremost an ironic kind of supplement to Ars 1 and 2, right? He suddenly reveals that this is an add-on for a female audience. It wasn't something that was introduced in the proem to Ars 1, at least not explicitly. So it's this unexpected supplement, add-on for a female audience, or an add-on for a male audience looking to enjoy the fiction of that sort of voyeuristic eavesdropping on a text for women. But it's also continually interacting with the project of erotodidacsis more broadly in Ovid, so the Medicamina and Ovid's Remedia Amoris. And it has its experimental roots in the Amores, of course, where Ovid is already a praeceptor amoris, he's already a teacher of love. He's teaching Corinna, primarily, on how to act the lover, how to implement love's codes and gestures. And the Amores already has, introduces to its audience the figure of the kind of competitive praeceptor amoris in the shape of the Lena, the female pimp, Dipsas, in Amores 1.8. So if I were teaching this unit, I would spend a bit of time at the beginning, I think, framing the book within Ovid's larger project. Not simply because, it's good to enrich students' knowledge of Ovid, but because taking Ars 3 out of context would tend to mislead, right? Especially in a unit that might give students the impression that they can straightforwardly access Roman thought on love and relationships from this, or via this incredibly playful and self-reflexive text about particular non-normative kinds of erotic relationships in this particular elegiac world, which has its own particular literary history and tradition. Okay, right, so in the prescribed literary sources PDF on this unit, on the Ars it specifies that learners should be able to do the following, to identify and respond to the following. The purpose and intended audience of this poetry. Not an easy task, first of all, as who the audience is meant to be in Ars 3 is not a given, it's a question. The social and political context, or social and poetic context, including the genre of the work. So careful attention needs to be given here to the term didactic poetry, right? And so the term I've been using so far, erotodidactic, is perhaps, although it's a long word, right, perhaps it's a more useful word to start with, right? Because, again, this is an intensely playful, ironic, even parodic version of didactic poetry that does really perverse things with Ovid's key didactic predecessors, so Virgil in the Georgics and Lucretius in the De Rerum Natura. Then the use of literary devices and the choice of language, the use of mythology, and the use of humour. So I want to focus on the last one, but I want, as it were, to read the list backwards, right? To put humour first and to see how it trickles down into all the other elements. So the first point I want to make is a kind of framing point, right? Humour is not an add-on in the Ars, right? It's not just an aspect of some parts of the text, but it's the key to reading genre, to reading erotodidaxis, the role of the addressed audience, and the use of literary devices and language. Now, of course, humour, right, it's an incredibly flabby term. So I think it'd be useful to start by getting students to unpack that term, first of all. You know, in what ways can a work of art or a literary text be humorous, right? So it might not be simply, you know, laugh out loud humour, funniness, right? Or, you know, straight farcical funniness, you might say, although there is some of that in Ars 3 for sure. I'll also be prompted to get to thinking about humour in terms of satire, in terms of sort of the sneering humour of misogynistic satire, especially in Rome, in terms of paradox, double-crossing, playing expectations and perspectives off one another, verbal humour, right? You might also introduce, you know, the basic idea that humour is part of Ovid's intertextual fabric, let's say, in as much as it is as one of its closest genres is comedy, new comedy. So it's constantly running through and riffing off the scenarios, characters, tropes of Roman and Greek new comedy. And like new comedy, along with satire, along with mime and fable, Ovidian elegy is playing with being the kind of feeble, lowly, non-successful genre vis-a-vis epic and tragedy, those highfalutin genres. So, you know, Ovid's persona, thinking of these sort of subheadings here, what does Ovidian elegy mock, right? You know, in many ways it is about mocking tradition, it's about mocking the pomposity of epic, real men as well as women, right? So there is a kind of humour and sort of mockery or sneering tone to the elegiac persona to begin with, right? He's pretending to be a rebel. He's pretending to be a slave, right? He's pretending to be a slave to the female in all kinds of ways. So he's not just mocking others and mocking, you know, these highfalutin genres with their ways of doing things. He's also exposing himself to ridicule. You know, that's a complex topic in that, you know, Ovid specifically is all about vaunting the elite male privilege while, you know, transparently acting the role of the slave. So that kind of trope gets quite, you know, subconsciously cliched and transparent in Ovid. But that's just to bear in mind, you know, all the ways in which, you know, it's set up as comic to begin with. So getting students to think, you know, do we treat this as a comic text? In what ways can a text be comical? Okay, a second framing point. Just because humour is complicatedly literary in the Ars, it doesn't mean that it's not telling us interesting things about Roman culture in the very early 1st century AD. All cultures produce and reproduce themselves in their humour. Jokes presume knowledge and beliefs, and they also reveal and test beliefs. But looking at humour in Roman thought, and especially in texts as witty as Ovid's third book of the Remedia, is quite a complicated business because the spotlight also gets turned on us as audiences, and Ovid is particularly cunning and witty in doing this. Do we get the joke? Are we being made fun of? What we make of Ovid's humorous take on love and relationships is going to inevitably expose our own beliefs, our own prejudices. And Ovid likes nothing better than to turn the tables and to make his audiences feel a little bit uncomfortable. And this is a particularly relevant idea, I think, when it comes to looking at how he's teaching, quote unquote, laughter, how to laugh in the middle of Ars 3. Why should rules on how to laugh, what to laugh at, make readers uncomfortable? Well, we would have various answers to that, and students would have immediate answers to that, right? But it might make sense to, and this is, I think, perhaps a good way of linking the stuff you're doing on Ovid, Ars Amatoria 3, with the stuff on Seneca, right, and Stoic thought generally on the passions, okay? It's useful, I think, to give students some background on attitudes to humour in Greek and Roman thought. And the key point to highlight would be that humour has long been, by the time Ovid comes onto the scene, has long been distrusted by thinkers from Plato and Aristotle onwards. And this is absolutely what, you know, in part at least, what Ovid is playing on in that section on laughter in the middle of Ars 3. So in his Republic, for example, Plato's Republic, Plato writes that he is suspicious of humour as it could lead to a loss of self-control, right? What Homer calls unquenchable laughter. And that is why he discouraged laughter in his Guardian class and urged that gods and heroes should never be depicted laughing. Aristotle, well, this is two bits of Plato. You've got the Philebus there. Comedy should be tightly controlled as well. Laughter comes from and reflects self-ignorance. Aristotle is a little bit more moderate, as usual. And in his view, the well-educated, they shouldn't act like buffoons. Right? But on the other hand, the right amount, just the right amount, of course he doesn't specify what the right amount is, or there's always some kind of instability and vulnerability there. But the right amount of tactful, sensitive humour is actually an essential part of the virtuous life for Aristotle. The Stoics too, I haven't given you Seneca here. There's lots and lots of stuff in Seneca on humour and laughter. It gets a little bit more complicated. This is a little bit more of a straightforward take-home quote from Epictetus. Let not your laughter be loud, frequent, or unrestrained, right? So the Stoics, as you know, valued emotional self-control. Even blushing, there's a famous Seneca letter about responding to somebody who's embarrassed at having blushed, right? Even blushing, so involuntary emotional reaction producing obvious physical symptoms is treated with suspicion, right? So even blushing is a problem, let alone, you know, getting the giggles or like collapsing in a belly laugh and not being able to control yourself. So already, you know, doing that, I mean, obviously you want to do it in a bit more detail, but from that brief sketch, we can outline a picture for students in which reacting to humour in love elegy is, potentially at least, especially self-implicating and risky. And, you know, there's a sense that we'll get to later where this is gendered too, so it may be particularly risky for men, because to enjoy this poetry is already to enjoy a world in which lovers reject traditional male virtus, they indulge in vice, and are forced to admit that the art of controlling passion will often fail. Right? This is about, you know, otium, you know, letting loose, right? Relaxing, indulging in desire as well as controlling it. So it's always going to be difficult to laugh in the right way at this text, because the text itself is already telling you that that game of self-control, of being a proper, upright, composed man and getting the upper hand, that kind of game is a game that you'll always sometimes lose, right? And that's part of the enjoyment of the text in itself. So, we'll come back to this idea because it may look quite tricky just laid out like that. But the essential point, I think, that Ovid is suggesting in this central passage on laughter is, and this is addressed, potentially to both women and men, if this stuff makes you laugh, well, check yourself first. Why don't you go and have a look in the mirror, before you start sneering and chuckling at others. Okay. So let's backtrack a little bit first, because in a way I've made the most complicated point without kind of saying something more basic about the Rs. The sort of basic joke from the beginning of this text, so I'm talking about the beginning of the Ars Amatoria as a whole, right, is the dubious notion that love or success in relationships can be taught. Okay? This is a poem that, in teaching love, tests and reveals the limit of all ancient poetry that teaches. Right? And it soon transpires, this is one of the kind of passages that really highlights that for us. It soon transpires that lovers, they might try to play by the rules, but the rules are liable to backfire. And as soon as actual emotions are involved. Right? So Ovid is continually playing off the idea that amor, love, is an art, an ars, against the idea that love is an irrational passion that you can try to control, but A, you're never going to 100% control it, and B, do you really want to? Right? Are you taking away all the pleasure, all the fun, if you try and get to a place where you're invulnerable? So when he says in Ars 1, 611 and then 615 to 16, you must play the lover. This is another way in which he's interacting with a comic performance, of course, the idea of the lover as an actor who's playing a particular set of roles and swapping between roles on the stage that is Augustan Rome. Right? He says, yet often the actor begins to love for real and becomes what he has pretended to be. Right? So even, so the paradox that the better you get at this, the more likely it is that you are going to shoot yourself in the foot, essentially. Okay. So here we see that these two things, right, love as art or love as passion, might not actually be opposites after all, right? One might actually lead to the other, which is an interesting way of thinking about it. So it's with this irony and instability in mind that I want now to turn to two passages from the middle of Ars 3, which you've got on your handout. They're sort of adjacent passages. Sorry about the patronising explanatory footnotes to the second passage. I just wanted to use them to sort of highlight the myths that are being referred to there in a way you might do in class. So it's Rs 279 and following, and then continuing from 499 and following. Okay. So as you know, lots of the poem is concerned with teaching lovers the correct behaviour, the right body language, the right dress, expressions, gesture, lingo, and so on. And here, famously, he's giving girls instruction on how to laugh. Now, there's an immediate paradox here, and I always say to students, well, in English we say, something made me laugh, don't we? Right? And why do we say that? Because laughter is a sort of uncontrollable psychophysical response to a stimulus. Right? It's not something we control or plan in advance. Right? Not usually, anyway. Right? And that's why there are all these philosophical suspicions about laughter as reflecting a lack of bodily integrity or self-mastery or self-control. Okay? So, this is the passage. I'm going to read it through. I haven't got it on the slide, but if you just follow on your handout. If your teeth are blackened, large, or not in line from birth, laughing would be a fatal error. Who would believe it? Girls must even learn to laugh. They seek to acquire beauty also in this way. Laugh modestly, a small dimple either side, the teeth mostly concealed by the lips. Don't strain your lungs with continual laughter, but let something soft and feminine ring out. One girl will distort her face perversely by guffawing, another shakes with laughter. You'd think she's crying. That one laughs stridently in a hateful manner, like a mangy ass braying at the shameful mill. Where does art not penetrate? They're taught to cry with propriety. They weep when and how they wish. Okay, so I'll stop that there. And then if we compare a very similar passage, and I partly wanted to highlight this passage because if you by any chance touching on Seneca's De Ira, on anger, or anything in his dialogues about irrational passions, paradigmatically anger, then this is a good way of joining the dots between those authors and making this unit cohere a bit more. So he says, if I might turn from lesser to greater things and spread the full expanse of swelling sail, it's important to banish looks of anger from your face. Right, so still addressing women. Anger swells the face. So fair pieces becoming to men, fierce anger to beasts. Again, you've got the dehumanization. Anger swells the face, the veins darken with blood, the eyes flash more savagely than the Gorgons. Away with you, flute, you're not worth all that, said Pallas Athena when she saw her face in the water. You too, if you looked in the mirror in your anger, that girl would scarcely know her own face. Pride does no less harm to your looks. Love is attracted to friendly eyes. We hate, believe the expert, extravagant disdain. A silent face often sows the seeds of our dislike. Look at him looking at you. Smile tenderly at a smile. He nods, you too return the signal you received. We hate sad girls too, etc., etc. So, very much an idea that we can relate to in the modern world, that, smile, it might never happen, that kind of street harassment that women are used to getting, right? But what we have in this particular passage and in the interaction between these two passages is a drama. It's a drama brimming with comic potential. And, it's a good, they're good test cases in many ways because reading out the potential humour of these scenes is, a good way into what close reading is, right, at A-level standard and beyond, right? What we're led to do is to test out one perspective or interpretation and then another. And what we'll be doing is sort of exploring the movement between one interpretation and another, which is essentially what close reading at any high level is. So we started off by saying that lessons in how to laugh sound like a contradiction in terms, don't they? It sounds oxymoronic, right? Comically so. It's a joke, right? Right? You can't seriously be teaching women how to laugh. If that's not the point, well, what is the point? Is the point to make girls incredibly self-conscious about their facial expressions and their behaviour and gestures in public around potential boyfriends, and for a male audience to imagine laughing at them, right? There's a lot of laughing at women in this passage, isn't there, available to a sort of putative, voyeuristic male audience, right? The image of girls as neighing horses, right, showing far too much gum, comparing women to unattractive animals is a classic misogynistic move, right? But there's also humour in the idea that a naive girl, right, who's really trying to please, might actually try to follow these instructions. And this is where, it is useful to observe just how lacking in instruction this passage actually is. Right? If we're telling students, well, didactic poetry is about teaching you things, about giving instructions, it has all these formulae for educating and instructing the reader in a direct way. This is my first quote from the Merriam article that I've given you in photocopy. As she points out, well, she's not quite right, is there? There aren't absolutely no instructions, but there are few instructions from Ovid on how women can laugh beautifully. Mostly it's negative stuff. So what would be the constructive advice to give women? Right? He does have a little bit, make sure you trill in this feminine manner, make sure it's not a guffaw. Right? And she says, when this from Ovid in his book of advice, when he offers tips on everything from walking to the choice of reading matter. So it's also a good place to start because you can get students to notice that actually this scholar is pushing it a little bit too hard, isn't she? There's not zero instructions, but there's few, and that's the point, right? So what is the poem teaching then? If you were to imagine a male audience reading this, right, what's in it for them? Well, it might be teaching them something like, you've got to develop the ability to see through these manipulative practices, right? Watch out, men. They're schooled up, and their laughter is designed to seduce and manipulate you. Right. Yeah, just one point before we go into this slide. If you're getting students to become more attuned to the ironies of this double audience, an imagined double audience, so women ostensibly, but also men kind of looking over their shoulder, as it were, you might get them to notice that in the first passage, the poet mostly doesn't address girls in the second person. He doesn't say, oh, girls, follow my instruction, this is what you have to do. He's referring to them in the third person. Girls always do this, right? There's this type that laughs like this, another type that laughs like that, right? And indeed, if he is addressing men as well as women, that kind of, third-person account has the effect of spurring on that male homosocial bonding that relies on shaming women who men might feel have too much power over them. Okay. And yeah, let's go to this slide now. The other point. This is Mary Beard's book, 2014, Roman Laughter. It's on your bibliography. I don't know whether you've looked at it. It has some bits and pieces. You wouldn't immediately go to it for Ovid, but it does actually have a few interesting pages on this topic in Ars 3. And she says, the joke is you can never actually follow these spuriously technical instructions. This is Jessica Simpson on the right, not Mary Beard. So when I've actually occasionally taught this passage, the first passage you've got on your handout, I've encouraged students to try and actually follow Ovid's advice. Right? So try and actually, always a good modern example to put out alongside Rs 3 are those now rather retro articles in Cosmopolitan, right? That aim to teach girls how to behave around boys, right? So in the manner of Cosmopolitan, try it at home, right? So if you try and do this, right? So at the top of the slide, laugh modestly, a small dimple either side, the teeth mostly concealed by the lips. It immediately makes you very, very self-conscious because it's an almost impossible thing to achieve, right? Maybe it's, you just have to be very, very skilled at it and the born actress, but certainly it seems to be, the idea that you might try it at home it seems to be itself, a source of humour. Whether it's you laughing at yourself or you as a sort of male or male-identified audience laughing at what you imagine to be the naive female audience trying this at home. Okay. So, hello there. Do you want to take a handout? So I don't have any handouts left, but you can have a... Oh yeah, I do have one. So this is a copy of a... yeah, so you'll have that to take home anyway. Okay, so the idea that this produces self-consciousness, which, you know, if you think about Ovidian ars, art, one way of translating that might be, or parsing it, might be to say it's about self-consciousness. So, you know, this might be another way that, you know, of teaching, right? You're producing self-consciousness. That might be actually a didactic aim in itself. And it's interesting that he's doing this with the one thing. See if you can think of any other examples. They don't really come to mind, other than perhaps blushing, that is involuntary usually as a response to something, right? So in other words, it's something devoid of ours in normal everyday life. And he's trying to say, as he says in that passage, there is nothing that ours art does not touch. It penetrates everything. And this is what he's showing us, right? So self-consciousness, right? Which is also something that, of course, teenagers have absolutely no problem understanding, right? In the culture of selfies and constant self-curating, right? Self-consciousness, you know, Ovidian ars is just there. You know, I've actually written something about the image of Narcissus in Metamorphoses 3 and selfies, the selfie culture. But that's by the by. So if you're getting self-conscious about laughing, you know, do I have an ugly laugh? Am I not doing it right? Is that why I haven't got a boyfriend? Yet this also applies, right? Thinking in terms of this, you know, double audience again, this is also going to apply to some extent to a male audience, is it not? Right? The sneering, giggling male audience or male-identified audience. Perhaps I've just laughed at the image of that girl braying like an ass, right? But then I become aware of the act of laughing itself, right? Now, if you read the larger passage, you'll understand that if you're male, right, well, Ovid is reassuring you that you can kind of get away with more. You can get away with a more raucous laugh. You know, socially acceptable laughter in Ovid organises the audience according to gender and class. That's clear. But you know, there is no way for them to completely escape self-consciousness about laughter or about being laughed at. Right? This isn't quite a point that Miriam makes in her article. So that's why I also think it's a useful article, because you can give it to them, you can give it to students, but also point to ways in which you could potentially take the argument further. So what I'm trying to suggest to you as an idea, not as a you know, a reading that's necessarily correct, but as an idea, that the text in Ars 3 becomes a kind of mirror, becomes a performance that doesn't just have comic content, but produces humour in implicitly showing us images of ourselves as we find this text funny. Right? So just a final point then, so we've got this conclusion here. This is partly why I put the second passage on your handout, right? Because here we've got explicitly the idea that a mirror, a real or a figurative mirror, can be used as a philosophical device, a teaching device, to shame subjects into controlling their emotions. And this is another point of contact with Seneca, right, in the De Clementia or the De Ira. And this idea is developed through two myths, the myth of Medusa and the myth of Narcissus, as well as Pallas Athene on the way between the two. So he's alluding to the Narcissus myth when he says that a girl who sees her face in the mirror while having a tantrum would hardly recognize herself. Now, Narcissus also famously does not recognize himself when he looks in the woodland pool, the natural mirror. and he falls in love with his beautiful reflection that he thinks is a separate person. Then he goes on to say that, you know, women need to have their own mirror, right, to check their emotions, but they also need to be the mirror, right? This is what the interesting bit about the second passage. So that when he says, look at him looking at you, smile tenderly at a smile, he nods, and so you too return the signal you have received. They need to mirror their boyfriend's expressions. Men like to have their own opinions and moods reflected back to them. That's the message. Now, a male audience can laugh at this, of course. You know, girls are so obedient and passive. Look how the poet is fashioning them for my pleasure, right? And this is the conclusion, really, that Merriam comes to. And it's a good quote to take out, as well as to show students in context. Right? So it's a way of, I mean, again, she rather over-eggs the pudding, perhaps. If women can be stopped from laughing through advice on beauty, that is, through an appeal to their vanity and stupidity implicitly, perhaps the power balance can be corrected and the torment will stop. Right? So it's about power, perhaps, right? Again, appealing to a male audience. But this is an imagined scenario. This is the last point I want to make. This is an imagined scenario that's also turning men into narcissuses, right? All they get is an echo giving them back their own, not just words, but gestures and feelings and moods, right? And as soon as we get the male audience implicated in the Narcissus myth, as soon as we get them to play Narcissuses, then they also become vulnerable, of course, right? Because we all know what happened to Narcissus. This is a tragedy, right? It didn't end well. He realizes that he's fallen in love with himself, and he dies of a mixture of shame and disappointment. So, you know, there are two ways of looking at this, I suppose. You know, it's offering men a fantasy of the obedient woman. But, you know, on the other hand, you might see it as Ovid dismantling that male fantasy that girls are really like them, with their, you know, the same gestures, the same opinions, the same sense of humour. What he's revealing to the male audience is that's just an act. That's just them playing you. Right? So, again, it works both ways. And I suppose that the key here is that figure of Medusa. Right? You know, you might laugh at Medusa, you know, how ugly and repulsive she is, but what happens when you look her in the eye? And it's interesting that it's imagining a meeting of gazes. They're looking at one another, and the woman is supposed to mirror the man. But if she's a Medusa, and what happens if he looks at her straight on? Are they laughing now, as it were? So the wonderful thing about these two passages, this is final couple of slides, and the thing that actually allows them to come alive as comic events is that these different perspectives with different implications that I've run through with you, they can't simply be flattened out. It's not like you can kind of decide, oh, well, I think that this was the intention of the author was that this was written for women, and there was no idea of the sort of men reading it as a sequel to Ars 1 and 2. These different perspectives, I think, are what the drama of the Ars Amatoria is all about. And they do amount to a kind of plot, right? You know, a kind of power game, a kind of tit for tat, right? It creates tensions, it creates movement. So, yes, that's just alluding to Medusa and her reception in feminist thought. But just look back to the very beginning of both Ars 1 and Ars 3. I remember in Ars 1 that he outlined this three-part work, right? But really doesn't specify that there will be anything like an Ars 3, right? Even if, right? what he describes in the last line. The third goal is to see to it that love will last. That seems to describe Ars 2 and not Ars 3. But at the beginning of Ars 3, he says, I've armed the Greeks against the Amazons. Arms remain to give to you, Penthesilea, and your Amazon troop. Go equal to the fight. So this isn't necessarily about equal opportunities. I'm not going there. But there is this kind of gender war going on, effectively, or potentially anyway, that comes alive in the centre of Ars 3 as humour, but also as a comic event that plays with humour and laughter on a number of levels. Okay, that's about all I have to say. I'm going to hand over to my colleague James now. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
You talk about the potential double audience.
Yeah.
How much do we know about the possible opportunities for women of the age and class to be reading this?
Yeah, well, this is an ongoing critical debate, right? I recommend that you read. It's a really neat. It's on your handout. There's not the whole introduction, but actually just a kind of section of the introduction to Roy Gibson's commentary in Ars 3. He has a bit on the intended audience of Ars 3 and summarises scholarship. I mean, obviously, that there is some evidence that women of a certain class would have been able to read this, for sure. But clearly, the female audience would have been much smaller than the elite male audience. So I don't think we're ever going to get to the point where, we're scientifically proving that women were excluded as an audience. Not at all. But certainly, when one looks at the evidence and remembers the...
So maybe like asking how many women in the 70s read Penthouse and the Playboy, something like that.
I'm not sure that would be the right analogy to make. I mean, this is an elite literary text. It's not a rag. So, and obviously then, the cultural context of
Or maybe how many women in the 1960s would have read Lady Chatterley's as Love? The judge said you wouldn't want your wife or daughter to.
Yeah, I mean, that might be a better analogy.
But did they?
Yeah, I mean, the problem with modern analogies is that they kind of throw up more problems than they solve often. Yeah, I mean, we know that women did. There were intellectual women who were rich women who would have read, and who were even scholars in the ancient world. But that chapter from Roy Gibson will give you a kind of up to date. That this is what we think, and this is the evidence that we're using. Yeah. Okay. Do you want to get that? Please.